In 1997, I said at the Foreign Affairs Committee that Iran and its nuclear program were the #1 threat to American national security. For the last 20 years, I've supported every effort to impose sanctions on the Iranian regime. And when the Iran nuclear deal was finalized and published, I was the first of either party to come to this floor and say that Congress should not vote to endorse that deal. But the question before us now is, should we renounce the deal? Now, it would be one thing if Iran decides that we're so tough on them on other issues that they choose to renounce the deal. That would be a complete, but that's not the issue before us today. The issue before us today is whether America should renounce the deal. And the resounding and clear answer is that is not something we should do at this time. Now, I'll give you an example. Let's say you bought a flawed automobile. In some jurisdictions, you take back the automobile, you get back your money. But what opponents, what some are proposing now, some are proposing that we renounce the deal. Imagine you're in a jurisdiction where you have to take back the car and the dealer keeps your money too. Taking back the car doesn't look like such a good idea anymore. Now, like a flawed automobile, the Iran nuclear deal is liable to not be working next decade. But that doesn't mean you take back the car and the dealer keeps the money. What happens if we renounce the deal? Iran keeps the money. We unfroze very roughly $100 billion of their money. If we renounce the deal, they keep the money. We delivered over $1 billion in currency on big pallets. If we renounce the deal, Iran keeps the money. And if we renounce the deal, Iran is liberated from all of the restrictions that it agreed to on its nuclear program. I opposed the deal because the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in the deal were temporary. I believe we need to extend and enforce those limitations on their nuclear program. And if you listen to the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, he has identified the fact that we have not been able to extend and make permanent the limitations on Iran's nuclear program as the chief flaw in the deal, or the chief thing to correct to turn it into a better deal. But if we renounce the deal, we don't extend and enforce the limitations on Iran's nuclear program. We end and eliminate immediately the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. I cannot think of a worse result. Now, there are two mechanisms that we could use as a nation to renounce the deal, give Iran all the benefits, and liberate them from all their obligations. The first of these is on our minds now because it could be triggered on October 15th. That is a day on which the president could in effect decertify this deal under the Iran Nuclear Review Act. I hope that if he does that, the press will not overplay it, because a decertification does nothing more than focus Congress's attention on whether we want to reinstitute the exact sanctions that were waived as part of the nuclear deal. A decertification does nothing more than focus our attention and over in the Senate provide for expedited consideration of new sanctions, of a reinstitution of the old sanctions, excuse me. Now, I don't think that Congress would be stupid enough to do that because, as I've explained, if we renounce the deal, Iran keeps the benefits and is liberated from its obligations. But the president should not decertify the deal and focus the world's attention on whether America will stand with the deal at this time. The second way that America could renounce the deal will occur next January, because the basic element of the deal, the basic thing Iran got from the United States, was an agreement that the president would, every sometimes 4 months to 6 months, depends on the exact statute, waive particular identified sanctions. As it happens, the existing waivers all expire in the middle of next January. And if the president were to fail to issue those waivers, that would be an American renunciation of the deal. So it does not meet our national security objectives to renounce the deal. What meets our national security objectives is to impose tough sanctions on Iran, draft those sanctions carefully, and explain them to the world not as a renunciation of the deal, but as appropriate sanctions given Iran's non-nuclear, outside the deal, wrongful behavior. Now, the question is, can we have sanctions on Iran and continue to force them to abide by the deal? The answer is clearly yes. In July of 2015, Secretary Kerry came before our committee, and I raised this very issue. If we adopt the deal, can we impose sanctions on the central bank of Iran to deter terrorism, or would that violate this agreement? And I specifically asked, is Congress and the United States free under the agreement to adopt new sanctions legislation that will remain in force as long as Iran holds American hostages or supports the murderous Assad regime? Secretary Kerry's answers were clear. He stated, "We're free to adopt additional sanctions as long as they are not a phony excuse for just taking the whole pot of past ones and putting them back." So, we can and should impose new sanctions on Iran to the extent justified by Iran's behavior outside the area of nuclear research and uranium enrichment. Well, look at that as an opportunity, because you could make a list of every sanction any one of us here on this floor has thought of and add in the creativity of the United States Senate and make a list of every sanction we could impose. And I assure you that those sanctions and more are justified by the non-nuclear evil committed by the regime in Tehran. Iran is more responsible than Russia for the hundreds of thousands of deaths in Syria. The lifeline of the Assad's murderous regime is a lifeline to the aid and money and weapons and thugs and training that Iran has provided. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, a moral responsibility of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You turn to Yemen, where tens of thousands of people have died because of Iran. You look at worldwide terrorism, and Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism year after year, according to our State Department. You look at the treatment by Iran of its own people, the murders by the state of anyone they identify as being part of the LGBT community, the murders by the state of women, it's usually women, accused of adultery. The evil that comes from the Islamic Republic far exceeds the ability of this House to identify sanction points. And that is why the proper policy for the United States is to impose the maximum sanctions and to explain to the world that this is not a phony renunciation of the nuclear deal, but is the appropriate response to Iran's actions that are outside of the nuclear deal. If we do that, we will have substantial support from Europe and Asia and elsewhere. First, for demanding that Iran continue to be subject to all the nuclear limitations and inspections that they agreed to under the deal, and which continue to be in force well into next decade. What we should do next decade, well, I'll come back here and give another speech next decade. But for at least many years, deep into next decade, this deal provides us with valuable limitations and valuable inspections of the Iran nuclear program, and Europe will insist that those be adhered to. Second, Europe may join us in the sanctions when we sanction Iran for its actions in Syria, its actions to its own people, its actions in Yemen. And one more I should add, and that is Iran's violation of UN Security Council resolutions by testing and developing missiles and exporting weapons. So if we stick with the deal and sanction Iran, they may choose, if those sanctions are as effective as I think they can be, they may choose to walk away from the deal. But if they do, we will have the whole world with us enforcing sanctions against Iran. Now, there is one part of the policy I put forward that may not meet the psychological needs of the President of the United States. For he has shown an uncontrollable personal need to pour disgusting liquids on anything associated with President Obama. And he gets maybe it meets his psychological needs to say he's renouncing the nuclear deal. But the fact is, we don't have to renounce the nuclear deal and liberate Iran from its obligations in order to impose the toughest imaginable sanctions on this regime that is doing so much evil. I yield back.